Today we are going to discuss the paranasal sinuses. The paranasal sinuses are basically air-filled spaces in the bones around the nasal cavity. The function of these sinuses is to make the skull lighter, and they also add resonance to the voice. These paranasal sinuses are lined by mucous membrane. The mucous membrane of these sinuses resemble that of the nasal cavity, and the mucus produced by the glands in the mucous membrane of these sinuses is eventually swept into the nasal cavity by the movement of cilia, which is present in the in these in this mucous membrane of the sinuses. Now there are four pairs of paranasal sinuses. In this diagram you can see this is the nose, and all the paranasal sinuses are related to the nasal cavity. So there is a pair of frontal air sinuses, then a pair of ethmoidal air sinuses, then a pair of sphenoidal air sinuses, and a pair of maxillary sinuses. We will discuss all these sinuses one by one in detail. Now let us first discuss the frontal sinus in detail. To know the location of frontal sinus, we mark a point at the nasion. The nasion is basically the junction of the internasal suture with the frontonasal suture. So this point is the nasion. First, we will mark a point over here. Then we will mark a point around 3 centimeters above this nasion. And the third point will be marked at the junction of medial 1/3 and the lateral 2/3 of the supraorbital margin. So this triangle, this represents the location of the frontal air sinus. So in this diagram I have marked the frontal air sinus. So this is a point right above the nasion, then another point 3 centimeters above the nasion, and the third point at the junction of the medial 1/3 and the lateral 2/3 of the supraorbital margin. So this roughly is the location of the frontal air sinus. Now this is the sagittal section of the skull, which is showing the frontal air sinus. So if you can see closely, the frontal air sinus lies between the inner and outer tables of the skull. The inner and outer tables are basically the compact bone which enclose the spongy bone in between. So this frontal air sinus is lying between the outer and inner tables, which are made of compact bone. And if you see posteriorly, it extends for a small distance inside the orbital plate of the frontal bone. This is a typical presentation of the frontal air sinus, but it has a lot of variations. We will stick to the typical presentation. Now, to know about the opening of the frontal sinus into the nasal cavity, we need to know a little about the anatomy of the nasal cavity first. This is the sagittal section of the skull in which you can see the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. The nasal septum, which forms the medial wall of the nasal cavity, has been removed to show you the lateral wall. In the lateral wall, you can see three projections. One is this. This is called the superior concha. The next projection, which is beneath the superior concha, is the middle concha, and below the middle concha is the inferior concha. Now in the next diagram, if we remove the middle concha, you can see an elevation beneath or deep to the middle concha, which is called the ethmoidal bulla. And just below the ethmoidal bulla is a groove which is called the hiatus semilunaris, and the anterior part of the hiatus semilunaris is called the infundibulum. So the duct of the frontal air sinus, which is called the frontonasal duct, eventually opens into the infundibulum of the hiatus semilunaris. In this diagram, both the superior and the middle concha have been removed. You can see these are the ethmoidal air sinuses, which we will discuss later. And this is the frontal air sinus, which is opening into the infundibulum of the hiatus semilunaris through this duct, which is called the frontonasal duct. Now coming to the arterial supply of the frontal air sinus. The frontal air sinus is supplied by the supraorbital artery and the anterior ethmoidal arteries. The supraorbital artery is the branch of the ophthalmic artery. This is the supraorbital artery, which is a branch of the ophthalmic artery, which in turn is the branch of the internal carotid artery. So as soon as the internal carotid artery emerges from the cavernous sinus, it gives a branch which is called the ophthalmic artery, which accompanies the optic nerve through the optic canal into the orbit. In this diagram, you can see the roof of the orbit, that is the orbital plate of frontal bone has been removed. Basically, this portion of the bone, the orbital plate of frontal bone has been removed, and you can see the inside of the orbit. And this is the eyeball, this is the optic nerve, and this portion is the optic canal, and this is the anterior clinoid process. So this artery is the supraorbital artery, which is arising from the ophthalmic artery, which in turn is arising from the internal carotid artery. So this supraorbital artery eventually goes to supply the frontal air sinus. The other artery which is supplying the frontal air sinus is the anterior ethmoidal artery. This artery here is the anterior ethmoidal artery, which also is a branch of the ophthalmic artery, which in turn is a branch of internal carotid artery. On the medial wall of the orbit, there are two foramina which are called the anterior and posterior ethmoidal foramina. The anterior ethmoidal artery leaves the orbit through the anterior ethmoidal foramen, and eventually it goes to supply the anterior part of the ethmoidal air sinuses and also the frontal air sinus. So basically the frontal air sinuses are supplied by the supraorbital and the anterior ethmoidal arteries, which are both branches of the ophthalmic artery, which in turn is a branch of the internal carotid artery. Now coming to the venous drainage of the frontal air sinus, there are two veins which drain the frontal air sinus. One is the superior ophthalmic vein and other is the supraorbital vein. The superior, in this diagram you can see the lateral wall of the orbit has been removed, and you can see the eyeball inside. This is the lacrimal gland, this is the optic nerve, and this structure here is the superior ophthalmic vein, which eventually enters into the middle cranial fossa through the superior orbital fissure and ends into the cavernous sinus. The supraorbital vein joins the supratrochlear vein to form the angular vein, which eventually goes down on the face. So these two veins, the superior ophthalmic vein and the supraorbital vein, they both drain the frontal air sinus. Now the nerve which supplies the frontal air sinus is the supraorbital nerve. Now let's try to find the origin of the supraorbital nerve. This structure here is the trigeminal ganglion, which is the ganglion of the fifth nerve or the trigeminal nerve. It eventually gives off its three branches, the ophthalmic, the maxillary and the mandibular nerves. The ophthalmic nerve then divides into three branches, which are the lacrimal on the lateral side, the frontal in the middle and the nasociliary on the medial side. This frontal nerve goes up anteriorly and eventually divides into the supraorbital and the supratrochlear nerves. So this supraorbital nerve eventually goes to supply the mucous membrane of the frontal air sinus. So I will repeat. You can let's just see what this diagram is showing. You can again see this orbit in which the superior wall or the orbital plate of the frontal bone has been removed, and you can see the eyeball with the superior rectus muscle over the eyeball. So this is the trigeminal ganglion, which is giving off its three branches, the ophthalmic, the maxillary and the mandibular nerves. The ophthalmic nerve then divides into the lacrimal on the lateral side, which is going towards the lacrimal gland, the frontal, which is going over the superior rectus muscle, and the nasociliary, which is going towards the medial side. This frontal nerve goes anteriorly and divides into the supraorbital and the supratrochlear nerves. So this supraorbital branch of the frontal nerve supplies the frontal air sinus. Now coming towards the lymphatic drainage of the frontal air sinus. First we will have to see the general overview of the lymphatic drainage of the face. This area, which is marked the area A, which is the lateral part of the forehead, upper eyelid, lateral part of the eye and upper part of the cheek, it drains into the preauricular group of lymph nodes which lies anterior to the auricle. The next area, which is the area B, which marks the middle part of the forehead, the medial part of the eyes, the nose, cheeks and most of the chin. This area drains into the submandibular nodes, and this area C, which is the lower part of the chin and the lower lip, this drains into the submental nodes. So as the frontal air sinuses lie in the area which is drained by the submandibular nodes, so the frontal air sinus will also be drained by the submandibular group of lymph nodes.